Good morning from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. A suicide bomber killed 6 civilians near NATO headquarters in the Afghan capital of Kabul this morning. And Illinois Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. has been released from the Mayo Clinic after being treated for bipolar depression at the clinic this summer. Right now, I'm joined by MSNBC contributor Victoria De Francesco Soto, senior analyst for LatinoDecisions.com and a fellow at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Democratic Congressman Gerald Nadler of New York coming back to the table, fresh off his time in Charlotte this week. John McWhorter, professor of linguistics and American studies at Columbia University and a columnist for the New York Daily News. And the legendary Joe Weisenthal, deputy editor at BusinessInsider.com, also returning to the program. Great to have you here. On Thursday, a few hours before President Obama was to give his speech accepting the Democratic nomination for president, he got a phone call from one of his chief economic advisors informing him of the jobs numbers for the month of August. The numbers, as we all found out yesterday, weren't very good. Just 96,000 jobs added to payrolls. Though 1 month's numbers are often revised and can bounce around quite a bit, the average monthly job growth for 2012 is now lower than it was for 2011. It's easy to imagine the president sitting with a draft of the speech and thinking about how to modulate its tone, knowing what the jobs headlines would be the next day. Throughout the entire campaign, the president has had to walk a fine line between hope and reality. Or maybe more accurately, he has had to thread the two together to explain how one connects to the other. The Obama campaign had projected that his speech on Thursday night would be a chance for the president to lay out an economic plan for the next 4 years. So the president stepped on stage in Charlotte and readjusted expectations.
The truth is, it will take more than a few years for us to solve challenges that have built up over decades. It'll require common effort and shared responsibility and the kind of bold, persistent experimentation that Franklin Roosevelt pursued during the only crisis worse than this one.
I love that line, and the shout out to FDR and bold, persistent experimentation, because it opens up the possibility of trying things, and that to me is what's so maddening about how we've dealt with the jobs crisis, particularly in the last 2 years since Republicans took over the House, is that we just have not been trying anything. Congressman Nadler, you were in the hall. How did you find the speech in terms of the way that it attacked head-on what is clearly, from a political perspective, the chief weakness for the president, which is the unemployment rate, which is the economy and the recovery?
Well, the president said what he could, and that is that we've looked at the progress we've made and how far we've come. I mean, we lost 8 million jobs. The catastrophe, the depth of the catastrophe is not really appreciated. We lost 8 million jobs. We've been gaining an average of, you take the last 2 years, about 160,000 jobs a month, which is not what we want, but is solid progress compared to the 700,000 or 800,000 jobs we were losing a month when the president came in. And the Republican Congress has blocked every attempt to continue this. I mean, the real and coming the day after President Clinton laid this out in slashing a much greater detail, I think the president did what he had to do. But I think that the key to all this, which hasn't been stated quite with as much clarity as I'd like to see, but I think
you've got the floor.
But I think after seeing President Clinton's speech, I think it probably will be, is the whole thing is really very simple. When the president took office, we were losing 800,000 jobs a month. We did the American Recovery Act, which we no longer call the stimulus bill because of Republican propaganda, but we did the American Recovery Act. We saved the car industry. We did a few other things and turned it around so that we were gaining 250,000 jobs a month by the middle of 2010. 250,000. We turned around 1 million jobs a month. And then the president, realizing that the stimulus was designed to be a 1.5, 2 year stimulus bill, said, all right, we've got to continue this. We've got to continue and accelerate the job recovery. And he offered the American Jobs Act of 2011, and the Republican Congress killed it and every single other attempt to keep the recovery going. So the real narrative is the Republicans created the catastrophe. The president and the Democratic Congress started fixing it and turned it around. And the Republican Congress stopped the progress.
And yes.
Which is why I'm not at all surprised that job growth in 2012 2011 was greater than average job growth in 2012 because we were still working off what the Democratic Congress with President Obama accomplished, and now they have blocked every attempt to keep this going.
And the Republicans are under the impression that somehow they would have done something to give us more jobs faster, in some way that they have an alternative. But it's clear that what they're really expecting is for jobs to be created through more passive sorts of processes that would take a very long time as well. And so obviously they don't have a better case either.
Well, it's about the external shock, and I thought this was very interesting. After seeing Obama's speech, I pulled up Bush's speech from 2004.
I just read that too.
And, you know, the similarities are striking.
Yes.
Not in content, obviously, but in style.
Yep.
Whereas Bush 2004 was saying, look, it's the terror issue. It was an external shock. We didn't make this happen, but we've got to plow through it. Obama. This external economic shock wasn't my fault. I came into it, but we've got to plow through it. And at the same time, I thought it was very interesting the parallel of how Bush hit Kerry on his economic weak spot, and Obama was hitting Romney on his foreign policy weak spot. So I'm just seeing a lot of similarities between 12 and 04.
I felt the same way, actually. I went back and read that speech. And because it is about crisis, it's about inheriting crisis, and then it's about leadership through that crisis, and about acknowledging the fact that things aren't great right now, but they're improving, and we've...
The big difference, obviously...
Yes, I mean, the
big difference is that Romney is proposing to repeat exactly the same policies that created the crisis. No one was in 2004 was saying, let's get Al-Qaeda to hit us again.
And I will say the other obvious difference is that the reaction to dealing with the crisis was far, 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 far better and more efficacious in the case of the Recovery Act, the Affordable Care Act, Dodd-Frank, than invading Iraq, which was the major response. Joe.
I think one of the things that's frustrating is that there are these good explanations for what's happening. So there is the fact that the Republicans blocked the second attempt at a stimulus. There's another aspect that you could really see in this jobs report, which is that the global slowdown is really hitting the U.S. So you have manufacturers had one of their worst months in a while, but actually like domestically oriented service things, food service, retail actually had the best month in a long time. So you really see this split. And in fact, it's actually a testament to the U.S. economy that the recovery in the U.S. is far better. Obviously, it's way better than in Europe. Brazil, China are slowing down hard. Yeah. The U.S. recovery is actually impressive on a global scale. Yeah. So what's frustrating...
If you're grading on a curve, the U.S. recovery gets an A, no question.
Right. And so what's frustrating is I actually thought Clinton did a good job the night before saying, look, it's not great, but here's the argument for the recovery. And yet when, I guess, the president doesn't feel he can do that because then he gets accused of abdicating responsibility. So it's kind of this either-or thing. You can't really make excuses for it, even though us sitting around here can explain it very well what's going on.
And the fact is also, it's rare in life that you get a controlled experiment in scientific laboratories. You've got a controlled experiment on the Republican Romney policies now in Great Britain, in France, not in France, but in Spain and Ireland, and they're catastrophic. Europe is collapsing economically, or parts of it, precisely in those countries where they're following the policies that Bush did here and that Romney wants to reinstate.
It's crucial that Obama starts to explain these things himself, I think. The idea that there's an explainer-in-chief who can do it for him is a nice idea, but it's at the point where if he doesn't start doing it himself, he's going to start looking even weaker than he was. And I don't think that it would kill the election for him to start doing it.
But we're starting to see some ownership. And that was what really struck me, and I know Ezra Klein has talked about this, where we started them saying, Obamacare, we are owning these messages, and I think that is a pivotal point. Now the president has to personify that more, but at least the party is gelling around them instead of running away like in 2010.
And the most concrete example of that, I would say, and I thought this was surprising, if you went back and we were sitting at this table in January 2009, and you said 4 years from now, when the president's at the convention, what will figure more prominently in the messaging and the case the president's making? The American Recovery Act, which has just passed, or the auto bailout? I would have definitely said the Recovery Act. I mean, that was where all the emphasis was on. It was a huge bill. It was kind of a remarkable piece of legislation, as we've chronicled on the show with Mike Grunwald, whose great new book, The New Deal, goes through it. But it is certainly the case the auto bailout has gotten way more attention, was much more front and center in this convention. I want to just show a bit of the speech about that and then talk about the role the auto bailout plays, because I think it has this kind of concreteness that almost nothing else does. Take a look.
I've met workers in Detroit and Toledo who feared they'd never build another American car. And today they can't build them fast enough because we reinvented a dying auto industry that's back on the top of the world. I've worked with business leaders who are bringing jobs back to America, not because our workers make less pay, but because we make better products, because we work harder and smarter than anyone else.
And that was the president talking about the auto rescue. Joe Biden, of course, talked about the auto rescue. In fact, he talked about it. He basically said there were two policies that you should judge the president's record on: the ordering the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound, and the revival of GM. I want to talk about the auto bailout and what the symbolism and politics of that are. And I want to bring in Jared Bernstein, one of the people who was sitting in the room during much of the deliberations over how to deal with the economic crisis. Right after we take this break. I want to bring in MSNBC contributor Jared Bernstein, former chief economist and economic policy advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, now senior fellow at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. And we played that moment from the speech about the auto rescue, and the auto rescue was really front and center. I want you to answer the question: if we'd gone back to January or February 2009 and you had to predict which of the two policies, the Recovery Act or the auto rescue, would feature more prominently in this convention, what would your prediction have been?
Mine would have been the same as yours, even though, by the way, neither were polling all that great, particularly the auto bailout. It was always kind of a head scratcher for me. That actually polled worse than the TARP at the time, believe it or not. I don't think I'd ever heard a senior official spend as much time touting the benefits of the auto bailout as the vice president did the other night. And you know, it's interesting. So a lot of people, I've been one of them, have been saying, boy, this is really a great intervention. I think the word iconic was used earlier in the sense of the auto industry, and I get that. I also think it's such a classical case study between the kind of interventions that you heard about in the DNC week versus the antipathy to those type of interventions in the RNC week.
And you also have the concreteness. At one point, Jennifer Granholm, in a speech that got a fair amount of attention, as much for its delivery as its content, just went through listing the number of jobs in different states. And that concreteness, I think, is also part of what is so remarkable about the political case for the auto rescue.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people don't know enough about is the supply chain that would have come down had GM and Chrysler essentially liquidated, because there simply wasn't the kind of private investor financing available at the time. And it was something that meant so much to us. When I was working for the vice president, we actually went to, I don't remember exactly where it was, but instead of going to one of the big auto companies at the end of the production line, we went to a bunch of suppliers and tried to explain the sort of job creation that was going on there. There are far more people that work in the supply chain that work in the end-of-the-line factories. So it's a very big deal for communities. And you said something a few minutes ago that kind of took me back about being in the room. I really was there in the Oval Office when the president was just, had to make a call, had to make a decision on this. And as the vice president said the other night, he was getting advice on both sides. This was not a slam dunk by any stretch of the imagination.
We were talking before about the Recovery Act, which is something, Jared, that you were closely associated with, and then the second round of stimulus that was proposed by the president called the American Jobs Act, blocked by the Republican Congress. Congressman Nadler, you made a good case about that obstruction and its effects. But the American Jobs Act did not appear in the president's speech. And it wasn't like, Joe, I mean, you've been someone who's been banging the table over at Business Insider for more stimulus, more efforts by the Federal Reserve, by Congress, by the president, by everyone to address the jobs crisis. Did you feel the president addressed it enough? Was there enough of a clarion call, enough of a drawing the distinction between what the Republicans are obstructing and what he is proposing?
No, actually, this is one of the points that I was frustrated by, which is this idea that we have a jobs crisis and we have a debt crisis. I think we don't have a debt crisis, and I would say if we're going to allocate our priorities, it should be 99% towards jobs and 0.5% towards debt, maybe, and not mentioned. And so I was really frustrated that he even went to, I guess I understand the politics, $4 trillion deficit cuts, whatever. One of my favorite economist, Richard Koo, has this great line. He says, talking about the national debt is like talking about, someone has a heart attack and they're being rushed into the hospital and the doctor's badgering them about their insurance as they're going in. It makes no sense. Fix the crisis you have right now. And I wonder, it just seems terrible salesmanship to argue for stimulus, or argue, which he kind of did in this vague sense of we're going to do nation building in the U.S. and stuff, while also conceding this broad point that we have this fictitious crisis, which doesn't exist.
One little addition to that, I very much agree with those sentiments. And in fact, given how low interest rates are right now in terms of government borrowing, the debt markets are actually kind of shouting out for more of the kind of jobs measures in the short term that would help to boost growth at a time when borrowing costs are so low that the contribution to the deficit relative to growth makes it a very good deal for the government.
I totally agree with what Jared and John just said. But let me inject a note of politics here.
Please, you are a politician.
From an economic point of view, from the point of view of the welfare of the country, we shouldn't even be talking about the deficit right now. We have negative, or for all practical purposes, negative interest rates. We ought to be borrowing more money, hiking the deficit in order to invest in infrastructure, in roads and bridges and highways and hospitals and education and things that will make the economy more competitive, will generate jobs right now and make us more competitive in the future. And when the times get good, then you pay down the debt. And that's a standard economics, which we learned in college. Unfortunately, you've got most of the press, the entire Republican Party, and a part of the Democratic Party saying we've got this terrible deficit crisis. And what we ought to do right now, we've got this fiscal cliff coming up. We ought to eliminate the entire sequestration, which was nonsense. The Republicans are saying get rid of the defense sequestration and double down on the social services. Romney points out quite correctly that if you sequester all those funds on the defense side, you're cutting jobs. Yes, but you're also cutting jobs if you sequester the other funds.
Right.
You ought to just admit that the sequestration was a mistake. It was a cave into Republican blackmail that will throw the country into chaos by not paying our bills on the debt ceiling. Just eliminate that entirely and do a number of other things. But the politics dictate.
Right.
Unfortunately, because we haven't laid a predicate over the last 4 years by explaining to the American people that the jobs are the real crisis, the deficit, which is hiked only because of the recession, because of the unemployment.
It is interesting that you just blew by something very important. Everybody's a Keynesian all of a sudden, right? All the Republicans are essentially talking the Keynesian book on the spending side.
Yep.
They're just doing it on defense, but come on.
Only on that. Everything else they're not Keynesian.
Right.
But there's
John.
more about politics, and this is getting to what you were talking about, Chris, which is that if we would have expected people to be more interested now in terms of pitching an election, the stimulus rather than the bailout, then this would be a country that had better educational policies than it has. And note how little that was talked about, i.e. not at all, at these conventions. We would have to have a populace that actually understood some of the basics of economics for the stimulus not to seem like such a dry subject, as important as it was, whereas the bailout is a story. You could make a movie about it. You have giving a job back to Joe Lunchpail, whether or not it was good to allow people to come back when they had wrecked their companies. All of that is easier to sell if you're trying to do something to swing voters. And so actually I would have predicted 3.5 years ago that when it came down to what you were going to make speeches about with music playing, it would be about saving big companies and giving Joe Lunchpail a job rather than something more abstract, such as the stimulus, even though to me it was more interesting.
And remember, this is the demographic that he needs most. The president has a solid base with the black and the Latino community, but that Joe Lunchpail demographic is the one that he is suffering the most with. And here he can put the name to the face, that electorate that is crucial in Ohio, Pennsylvania, the swing states.
The president also talked a lot about the sort of future agenda, which I thought was remarkably consistent, actually, with 2008. We'll take a look at that. And I want to talk about a line from Bill Clinton's speech about what's causing the jobs crisis that actually made me panic a little bit about what is in the mind of Democratic policymakers right after this break. You know, there's this story about Barack Obama on the American right, which is that he was this stealth candidate, essentially. He wasn't vetted, that he was this crypto leftist with these nefariously grandiose visions of bending the trajectory of American freedom towards tyranny, socialism, and a European state. And what's remarkable is how the inverse of that is true in so much as the domestic policy agenda, this is not true, I think, about civil liberties and foreign policy, but the domestic policy agenda that he set on the campaign over a very long campaign is precisely what he did when he got into office, more or less. And there's a remarkable amount of consistency, actually, in the basic economic domestic policy vision. And this is, we went back and sort of compared the 2008 convention speech and the 2012 convention speech, and you can get a sense of that just if you take a look.
No family should have to set aside a college acceptance letter because they don't have the money. We will keep our promise to every young American. If you commit to serving your community or our country, we will make sure you can afford a college education. I've cut taxes for those who need it. Middle-class families, small businesses. I will cut taxes for 95% of all working families. Because in an economy like this, the last thing we should do is raise taxes on the middle class. We've opened millions of new acres for oil and gas exploration in the last 3 years, and we'll open more. As president, I will tap our natural gas reserves, invest in clean coal technology, and find ways to safely harness nuclear power.
Now, some of those policies I myself don't like. In fact, clean coal is a ridiculous fiction, and we're not going to drill our way out of the crisis that is headed towards the planet. But you can't say that it wasn't consistent. I mean, there really is a remarkable, and I think it was so interesting that the dominant story about this speech was the difference between 08 or 04 and 2012, when in a lot of ways, and this is, I think, true of the figure of Barack Obama in so many ways, there's been a kind of remarkable consistency. He is who he is. He's had the vision that he's had, and the sort of basic squarely in the middle of the Democratic coalition politics from the.
And the bedrock was also of healthcare reform, and in that clip we didn't show that, but he ran on that. That was what anchored his campaign, and he delivered on it.
Yeah.
And for a long time, Democrats were running away from it, but they've finally come back to embrace it, and you can link that to the economy. Whereas in this time of social need, it becomes even more relevant.
I would say a Dinesh D'Souza, for example, would say that was part of the socialism, though. Even if Obama was being open about it, that this was a major problem, even
But it's no surprise. He said it in 2008.
But wait a minute. Part of socialism. The dominant reality of our politics today is two things. The Republican Party has become an extremely, I would say, radically right-wing party on social issues and on economic issues. The Democratic Party has become a very liberal party on social issues and a much more conservative party than it used to be on economic issues. If this were 30 years ago, if Obama were not essentially a centrist, if the party weren't very centrist now, we would have taken Medicare and expanded it a single-payer system to the entire population instead of essentially a 1993 Republican plan for providing insurance through the private sector, through the insurance companies. This is not socialism.
Yeah, that's what the actual original intention was under the table, I thought.
Jared.
Medicare.
Yeah, no, it is really remarkable. I mean, for example, most people think that the president raised a lot of people's taxes.
Yeah.
And of course, he has done exactly the opposite in a pretty big way. I'd also say, it's kind of echoing Jerry, the extent to which you see things move to the right, you can see that in the regulatory discussion. Right? Who in their right mind would argue that at this point financial markets can regulate themselves? And so the president, who I think is pretty pragmatic and centrist on many of these ideas, gets behind financial regulation. And that becomes an issue that's going to tear the financial markets down. They can't possibly survive if they have to pay any attention to anybody looking over their shoulder. They can regulate themselves. Well, we saw what that did. So I do think it's very much a move to the right. Yeah. Yeah,
and there's this. Yeah, the overlaid on that, right? I mean, the president, the way the president's campaign wants to talk about it is not left-right for a whole host of reasons, and obviously any nomination speech at a convention is aimed towards the middle. I mean, Mitt Romney's speech was, there was very oblique references to social issues. He didn't even say something like marriage between a man and a woman. He said the institution of marriage. The president's speech, similarly, squarely focused at the middle of the electorate. And the choice that they've set up isn't this left-right, right? It's forward or backward. And this is just, I want to give a taste of that, the basic contours of this forward-backward argument.
I've cut taxes for those who need it. Middle-class families, small businesses. But I don't believe that another round of tax breaks for millionaires will bring good jobs to our shores or pay down our deficit. I don't believe that firing teachers or kicking students off financial aid will grow the economy or help us compete with the scientists and engineers coming out of China. After all we've been through, I don't believe that rolling back regulations on Wall Street will help the small businesswoman expand or the laid-off construction worker keep his home. We have been there. We've tried that, and we're not going back.
It's a very effective argument to me. But what's interesting here is that you have two planes upon which this is happening. There's the long-term vision, which is why there's that consistency 2008 and 2012. Long-term vision of building an America that can out-innovate, out-compete. This is the phrase that the president's people use. What is the long-term trajectory of the American economy, right? Rebuilding it. Then there's the short-term jobs crisis, which continues to burn across the land, essentially unaddressed. And I think that I understand the political decision to focus on that long-term vision because you're talking about a second term. But it remains the case that the most pressing part of our politics is just there and not being addressed. And I want to return to how we can address it, how to think about the politics of that going forward after we take this break. All right, we're talking about the president's speech this week at the DNC and also the ways in which he was making the economic case. And there's a sort of long-term case and a short-term case. And I want to return to the short-term because I think that's the thing that gets less emphasis. And I don't think it's because I don't think it gets less emphasis because the president of the Democratic Party cares about it less. In fact, I think they care about full employment in the near term far, far more than the Republican Party does. But because of, A, the politics of it at the moment, and B, the fact that the real solutions are things that have been politically cut off by the kind of conversation we've had. And before you could talk about how to solve the jobs crisis, there's got to be a theory about why we have a jobs crisis, which is, I think, a massive financial crisis followed by a recession, a lack of demand, right? But Bill Clinton had this line in his speech the other night, which I thought the speech was remarkable and fantastic, and everyone said that. There's one line, though, that gave me a little bit of worry when he said the following.
We need a lot more new jobs. But there are already more than 3 million jobs open and unfilled in America, mostly because the people who apply for them don't yet have the required skills to do them. So even as we get Americans more jobs, we have to prepare more Americans for the new jobs that are actually going to be created. The old economy is not coming back. We've got to build a new one and educate people to do those jobs.
There's roughly two theories about why we have a jobs crisis. Cyclical, right, which is that we had a huge recession and there's a lack of demand and we need to boost demand. And a structural story, which is kind of the story Bill Clinton was telling, which is there's a mismatch between the skills that are needed and the skills Americans have. And so that's a deeper structural problem, and just plowing money into demand is not going to fix it. And if you think that, then you don't think there's much to be done in the short term, which is what worried me about that Bill Clinton moment. Joe, I want you to respond because you've been fighting this battle a lot, and then I want to hear from you, Jared.
Okay. Yeah, there's this tendency, I think, among like really smart people in Washington, D.C. to think the problems are really big and we need, big solutions about changing people's skills or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that the jobs crisis is cyclical. It's the fact of weak demand. There's lots of evidence for this. Edward Lazier, who's a conservative economist at the Hoover Institute, actually just came out with a paper at the Jackson Hole Conference last week where he pointed out the simple fact. He said the industries that lost jobs the hardest during the downturn have gained jobs back the fastest during the upturn. If we had experienced some big shift in the economy, we wouldn't have expected to see that. There's other research that shows that in the counties where there's the most household debt going into the crisis, those have had the worst economic comebacks. Again, it all suggests that the issue is lack of demand, over-indebted household sector, and so forth, not some big idea about how we need to completely retool America's world.
Jared, you're on the inside, and I want to hear, does the structural theory have purchase among people that are close to the president, or do people inside that White House see it as a demand problem, as a cyclical problem?
Demand, cyclical, including the president. Look, that's in a 50-minute speech, that's the one thing the former president got wrong. In fact, if you actually look at those numbers, in a typical economy, there's twice that many unfilled job openings. That's just frictional, nothing to suggest structural at all. And in fact, college unemployment rates are quite elevated, which is another reason why you wouldn't believe that. But listen, in terms of the short term, you're absolutely right. But with fiscal policy, as Jerry Nadler was talking about, that kind of demand fiscal stuff is off the table right now. I see only two things in the near term that could help, that might be possible. One is the Federal Reserve, which is kind of outside the system, and we haven't talked about that, but they could help, and probably this week they will. But the other is solving the fiscal cliff. I actually think that would be something that would really help the economy, and it's something we should do yesterday. There may be enough political grown-ups in the room to accomplish that sometime in the next few months.
I just want to finish this off by saying the Democrats do have, we should just hammer this home. There's an American Jobs Act. There's a bill sitting on Congress that is a short-term demand side solution, or at least a way of addressing the cyclical jobs problem. There is nothing, as far as I can see, for the Republicans about that in the short term.
The Republicans say nothing. All they say is, and it was remarkable in Romney's speech, all he said is, reduce the debt and that'll create jobs.
Right.
How, why?
Romney actually has school choice as part of his jobs
That's not
plan.
working in Europe.
Right, and let me just say, low-hanging fruit. We've lost 600,000 public sector jobs in this jobs crisis. If public sector jobs had continued to keep pace with population growth, we would have about a point lower unemployment.
We haven't lost 600,000 jobs. We've deliberately thrown away.
We've thrown away
600,000 public.
So there is low-hanging fruit. Jared Bernstein, former chief economist and economic policy advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. Thank you for joining us this morning. And
My
Joe
pleasure.
Weisenthal, deputy editor at BusinessInsider.com. Thanks a lot, man.
Thank you.
All right, watching the Democratic National Convention over the past week, it was hard not to notice the gleefulness with which the Democrats engaged on the issues of culture war.
Women are more than capable of making our own choices about our bodies.
Control healthcare choices that women should be making for themselves.
When it comes to letting people love who they love and marry who they want to marry, Mitt Romney says no.
Mr. Romney, my family is just as real as yours.
It's not just dreamers. Democrats value all immigrants.
President Obama believes that even though those dreamers, those kids, didn't choose to come here, they have chosen to do right by America, and it's time for us to do right by them.
The rhetoric has been matched by movement in the platform. For example, the 2004 Democratic platform left the issue of marriage equality to the states, saying, in our country, marriage has been defined at the state level for 200 years, and we believe it should continue to be defined there. Just 8 years later, the platform now reads, we support the right of all families to have equal respect, responsibilities, and protections under law. We support marriage equality and support the movement to secure equal treatment under law for same-sex couples. These new positions have been so normalized over the past year as to seem inevitable. So it's easy to forget that just 8 years ago, the conventional wisdom was that the culture wars benefited Republicans. In fact, Republican operatives pushed anti-gay marriage ballot initiatives in swing states to turn out their base. And just 4 years ago, actually just 4 months ago, President Obama's official position was still that marriage was defined and should be defined as between a man and a woman. On immigration, it wasn't until June of this year the president announced he would use his executive power to enact a dreamlike immigration policy. What happened, and what does it say about politics in this country and shifts in the electorate? The Democrats now seem so confident they have the upper hand on issues of choice, marriage equality, and immigration. Joining me is Nancy Keenan. She's the president of NARAL Pro-Choice America, also a speaker on the stage in prime time during this week's convention.
Thanks,
it's great to have you here.
Wonderful to be here.
So those are three issues. Marriage equality, immigration, and choice that are the classic wedge issues, going all the way back to the memo that Patrick Buchanan wrote to Richard Nixon in the 1970s, where he says we can cut the country in half and I think we'll get the bigger half. And he was at that point talking about law and order and busing particularly. But the idea being there's these issues where you want to heighten the contradictions, you want to focus on dividing people because we've got the majority on our side. And Democrats have acted politically for a long time on these issues in the kind of defensive crouch, thinking the Republicans are right. And I just think the most striking part of this convention was the total reversal. And I want to go to you on the issue of choice and women's health more broadly. You've been working on this issue for a while. What has happened? Do you agree with me it was different at this convention? And if it was, why?
Well, I think that first, around the issue of choice, that American public has remained steadfastly pro-choice. And all the polling shows that. We don't see that it changes dramatically. I think what happens is that the political landscape changes a bit. When we had in the late 80s and early 90s, then Governor Bill Clinton, and a lot was at stake. Casey was being debated in front of the Supreme Court. People were paying attention to choice. The president, then running for president, Bill Clinton, was talking about it a lot. And so we saw this surge of interest in the issue of choice. Democrats won. The issue fell off the radar screen after that. But then we see a spike at the state levels. And so we see the anti-choice rhetoric gear up at the state level when we tend to have a pro-choice president. So it's not that things have changed. I think other priorities take place in people's lives. They're watching, whether it's their jobs, whether it's something else. But the minute this becomes something in front of the Supreme Court, it raises it up, and people begin to have a much more attention in what's at stake if it were to be repealed.
So your theory, there's the kind of pendulum back and forth, to and fro battle being waged, and the issue rises and falls in prominence, as opposed to some kind of, because I think on the marriage equality, it feels to me like a steady march in one direction, right?
Well, yeah, but let me talk about that. I mean, look at the difference. We have this demographic of millennials under 30 years old. The issue of gay marriage was something they wanted. Something that they didn't have and they wanted. The issue of reproductive choice and the access to reproductive health is something that they have. Right. And so the energy around that isn't, I need to protect it. It's like, let's stand up for the status quo.
I think the story is also the dynamic between the federal and the state level. Yes, it is cyclical, but what happened in 2010 is we had this wave of Democrats coming to the state legislatures. So now the state legislatures are 53% Republican.
And Republicans coming to the state legislature.
Yes. And so then what we're seeing is a lot of abortion-related restrictionist policy. So then we see the backlash in terms of the Democrats asserting themselves. And I do think it's going to continue for a while, because redistricting happened under 2010 state legislature.
We're showing this remarkable chart that Rachel has shown during some of our primetime coverage, which is state abortion restriction initiatives, which just absolutely spike after those 2010 elections. But then, interestingly, come down quite a bit, which I think speaks to the politics of the issue. And I just want to show some polling real quickly, too, because, I mean, basically, abortion is one of these questions where I think the majority is pro-choice as a legal constitutional matter, but the responses of people really go all over the place depending on how you phrase the question, but it's been very consistent. I mean, that's unlike the marriage equality issue. I think the polling on choice has been pretty consistent since 1975, more or less. And so, you see there the Gallup, legal under certain circumstances, legal under any circumstances, and the pro-life position of the Republican Party, which is illegal in all circumstances, essentially was 19% in 1975, 20% now. There has not been a lot of growth in that.
I think there's been a couple of changes.
You hold that thought for 1 second, because I also want to bring in Stan Greenberg, who's been polling on this for several decades as well, right after we take this break. Congressman Nadler, you had a point that I was sorry to break up there.
Yeah, very quickly, I was going to say that the polling hasn't changed on the issue. Most people are pro-choice, but not totally under all circumstances. For years, the right wing managed to frame the debate about seemingly extremist questions such as partial birth abortion. But the Republican Party has now become so right-wing on the subject and so extremist that now they're talking about extremes on the other side, of prohibiting abortions in case of rape or incest, or the health of the mother, or even the life of the mother.
Even the personhood amendment. So even one step further back, where before contraception that you're already...
And therefore prohibiting contraception. So when you deal with these issues, of course, it seems extreme, and it is extreme.
Stan Greenberg, pollster who has been good morning, great to have you. You've been polling this issue for a while, and I'm curious, when you look at choice specifically, but then broader, this kind of portfolio of so-called cultural issues, are we seeing movement in the polls that explains the rhetoric and the more forward-leaning rhetoric we saw on the stage?
Yeah, I think it's actually a very, very big. It's a bigger issue than you're describing it, and I think you've set it up for that, answer. In part, it's about women and young people and kind of more affluent suburban voters and drawing them more to the president. It's in part the extreme positions they're taking, but it's much bigger question about what these two coalitions really have developed as and stand for. There's a worldview associated with Democrats. It's diversity. It's tolerance, it's women's rights, it's different kinds of family, it's a little more secular, pro-education science. There's a worldview, and when that worldview is we're fighting about that, Democrats have a much, much bigger advantage. When you're just talking about spending and budgets and deficits and very material things, then you get like a 2010 election.
That's
and so now we're looking at a different kind of election.
John, how does it strike you as someone who had been sort of on the American right in a way, or associated with institutions for a while?
Sympathetic to the American right when it comes specifically to race questions, where I think that a lot of their positions would have been liberal in 1960. I would say that the dog that hasn't barked in this convention is the black issue, and I have to speak to it because I think that if a war is something that people win and lose, then the right has won on issues such as, for example, welfare reform, where the latest news on that is Obama being accused of trying to peel it back, and the defense, and the proper one, is that he is looking to bolster people being put into work rather than staying on welfare, which means that the right wins on that one in terms of affirmative action. This doesn't happen to be the year for that, but it also hasn't been noticed. It's coming up, but frankly, I think the right's going to win on that one as well. We're not going to have the kind of affirmative action that was classic in the 80s and 90s. So it's not necessarily that the Democrats have completely taken control of the culture wars, because in some parts of them, and I would say on the black one, it's certainly true, it's the other side that has won, which is why we're not hearing it.
Although this question about what these two coalitions increasingly look like, I think is really the key heart of the matter. So I want to talk more about that, and particularly the decision to not just embrace the executive authority for a DREAM Act-like program, but to put someone on stage who is herself undocumented, and what that means about the politics of that issue right after this break.